Welcome to the Here's Waldo podcast, where we sit down with top visionaries and creatives in the video game industry. Together, we'll unravel their journeys and learn more about the path they're forging ahead. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hi, I'm Lizzie Mintis, founder and CEO of Here's Waldo Recruiting, a boutique video game recruitment firm. This is the Here's Waldo podcast. In every episode, we dive deep into conversations with creatives, founders, and executives about what it takes to make a successful video game. You can expect to hear valuable lessons from their journey and get a glimpse into the future of the industry. This episode is brought to you by Here's Waldo Recruiting, a boutique recruitment firm specializing in the video game industry that prioritizes quality over quantity and values transparency, communication, and diversity. We partner with companies, creatives, and programmers to understand the why behind their needs and provide a white glove experience that ensures a win-win outcome. Today, we have Bernard, or Bernie, Yee with us. He was an executive producer and TPM at Oculus on the Oculus Rex team in Seattle. Oculus Rex has created the seminal VR experiences for Oculus current-gen hardware. Bernie has worked in the gaming industry on a wide variety of games and genres, in both development and publishing roles, most recently PopCap as a lead producer on Plants vs. Zombies 2 and Peggle 2, and Bungie, where he worked on Destiny. Prior to moving to Seattle, Bernie worked at smaller game startups in New York City, and also Harmonix, Rock Band, Atari, Disney Interactive, and Sony Online Entertainment, EverQuest. He also taught game design and production at the Columbia University School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. He's currently the founder of an unannounced game startup called Windup Minds. Let's get started. Thank you for being here today, Bernie. I'm excited to talk to you. What can you tell us about your new studio?
It's a pleasure, Lizzie. Thank you for having me. It's been quite a journey. It's funny because when you work at a company, everything is already done for you in ways that you just have no idea about, like from recruiting to HR to onboarding to interview processes. And when you're starting a studio, I mean, I thought it was bad when you had to start up a new production process from scratch. But when you start a team, everything that you took for granted, it's not there, and you have to do it. Like if you're the founder, you don't get someone else to do it. You look around and you're like, who's doing this? I guess it's me. So I am in the middle of trying to put together with my team all the operational details that make a studio possible, even before the game gets started. So it's quite daunting, actually.
Yeah, it's a lot. I've been there.
Yeah, we talked about this.
Opening up business in a new state and thinking
licenses and insurance and general liability insurance and health care and all this stuff. It's a lot.
It's an adventure. Can you tease us about what it is that you are setting out to do it all? What's your vision?
Yeah, I can. I think I've long believed that, especially coming into VR, the best games for a new medium, take advantage of the unique things that medium does. So in VR, VR has a very particular experiential affordance list, right? There are things you can do in VR that you cannot do elsewhere. And there are things elsewhere that just are better elsewhere than VR. And I'll give you like an example, right? Is that in VR, you really feel like things are real, like these imaginary things in front of you, like it could be an alien, it could be a dinosaur. They're real, right? Your lizard brain tells you it's real. And no other medium can do that, right? Versus things that in other media like, console games, stick movement is obviously not even a discussion. Of course you can move your character around on a console game, but in VR, it makes a lot of people motion sick, right? So there are things that console games can do and things that VR can do in mixed reality. So we really want to build around this idea that the best games in VR are going to be the ones that take the best advantage of it. And this goes back to one of the first things my team built for Oculus was an experience called Dream Deck, and it was a series of vignettes that put people in different sort of VR scenarios. And one of them is you're standing in a hallway. You can see a banner that says Hammond Museum, which is both a reference to the environment artist Eric Hammond, who did that scene, as well as, Jurassic Park. And down this hallway, a T-Rex kind of comes around the corner and lumbers towards you. And it stops in front of you and will sniff at your head. And if you move your head, the T-Rex's head like follows you around and is like sniffing you. And we've had people tear their headsets off, and people being my wife and my son and other people, because they thought it was real, right? And they knew they were standing in a room, a demo room inside an Oculus office, but their lizard brain was telling them that they were in a room with a dinosaur. And I think the kind of games we want to make really focus on this illusion we tell our lizard brain that the thing is real. That's all I'm going to say right now. But I think there's a kind of game genres that will exist in VR that don't exist in the same way in console games. I think that are going to be like really impactful in a way that we just haven't seen before. That's a small bet. I know, not very ambitious. But I think it's really, I've been around the game industry to see, these patterns come out over and over again. And I think they're good. Each medium is going to give rise to something that just like we couldn't imagine how good they were on the old platforms. And then we're going to look back at them like, of course it was going to work in VR. And I hope to be one of those teams.
I just talked to Ed Freeze on the last episode, and he said that the founders that really make a difference are the ones that have some crazy brand new idea. And those are the pitches that he gets so excited about. So I can't wait to see what you're up to.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I hope he's right. I hope I'm one of those people. Ed should know. He's seen a lot of that.
He's definitely seen a lot. What made you decide to launch your own thing? It's a scary decision.
So it's interesting. Like I was laid off by Meta in November of 2022. And I had a great run, right? I joined Oculus before the acquisition. I came in at a pretty good stock price. I've done, fairly well for myself during the time there. And the severance package was really excellent, right? So I bear kind of no ill will to the company, even though I think it's hugely their loss. But I kind of realized that companies make decisions that aren't human because companies aren't human beings, right? So I don't think of it as personal. I think of it as just a casualty of like a natural act of God, essentially. Like I can't explain it. And I thought, what am I going to do? Right? Am I going to go back and work for someone else again? Or should I try something else? And to be honest, I've been wanting to get back to games for a long time. I think companies like Meta and Google and even Apple, I think, show how hard it is to be creative in a truly kind of artistic way, like a commercial art form. Like game developers understand this, but how hard it is to be creative in these companies. You look at Google and Stadia, you look at some of the things that Meta has tried to launch that are game-like Horizon Worlds, that have struggled not from lack of technical excellence, but from like a creative sensibility, right? And games are hard. So I was thinking I wanted to get back to games anyway. And I had shipped some pretty significant things with my team. I think some of the best VR experiences that have ever been made. And a lot of people in the industry knew it, and they knew of my team's reputation and my work. And it's funny, sometimes people on the outside realize how good your work is more than on the inside of Meta, right? So one of the VCs who had been active in the VC world said, well, why don't you start your own thing? So even while I was interviewing, I was thinking, well, maybe I should start my own thing. Yeah. And it all kind of came together shockingly fast. I think every experience is different. But I know it was a hard time, or people tell me it was a hard time to raise money, but we raised money. This person who kind of poked my ribs and said, try to get in the game, ended up coming on as an investor. And the other thing too is like you always complain, or not you, but I would complain like, oh, they don't know how to do a thing, and I could do this better. And like, at some point, you put your money where your mouth is, right? If you really think you can do this better, go do it better. Don't just complain about it from the background. So I figured I've seen enough. I've learned enough. I learned a ton at Meta, Oculus. I learned a ton at PopCap. I learned a ton at Bungie. Like really, these three places really changed the way I think about game development. And they're very dramatically different. And I felt like I had a good opportunity to like build a team from scratch with the kind of people and the kind of culture that I valued through lots of trial and error and lots of teams that were dysfunctional or had elements of chaos in them. So, financially, I was in a position to do it. My success and my fame, as such as it is from working in VR, is only declining every day, right? Like every day I have less cred. So if I'm gonna use it, I felt like it was the time. And I think we can make something, a lot of this work is a continuation of things I've been thinking about at Oculus for the last 8 years. So this is the time to do it, right? And I think VR is going to hit a pretty big inflection point with mixed reality, both with the Quest 3 and Apple Vision Pro. I think that's going to change how people look at the device fundamentally. So everything's sort of aligned, and I jumped in like I'm ready to go. So that's how I got here.
Congrats on your funding. And you talk about the team that you've built a little bit. Can you elaborate more on the kinds of people that you've hired for your founding team and why you've identified the people that you have?
It's interesting. On my team, and I'll include kind of full-time contractors and employees. We have 3 men, 4 women, 1 person of color, 2 people of color. The core engineering team are both women.
Wow.
And we ended up with, a super diverse group of people. I'm not sure how we got here, but it's exactly the kind of makeup I wanted for this kind of game. So that's how that we ended up with like a really diverse team without planning to. And I think, I asked one of the engineers I'm working with how we got here, and she said, everything you hear about diversity is the more diverse leaders you have, the more diverse pools they draw from.
Yeah.
And I am a person of color. I'm Asian. I think a lot of people in technology don't think of Asians as diverse, but I think if you look at the C-suite of Silicon Valley, it's still predominantly white and male. Even while a lot of the engineering leaders might be Asian, the C-suite is not. In fact, I think Facebook just got their first person of color in Mark's team this last year, who's an Asian woman. So despite the fact that a lot of senior leaders at Facebook were Asian, like no one in Mark's sphere was Asian. It was a person of color till now. So so I think that has a lot to do with it. And I think the other thing, is that there are a group of people that worked with me that seem to be interested in working with me again. So, and I can't say everyone, I wouldn't say that I was universally beloved by everyone I've worked with, but the certain group of people felt like I created a team culture that was welcomed all opinions, that really empowered people. On my old team, I was responsible for hiring a number of the women on the team, originally as contractors and converting to full time, and now they've gone into senior roles at Bungie and Riot. I don't know. I think I gravitate towards people who are a little more off the stereotype, maybe because I myself have not necessarily representative of a lot of folks who work in games or technology. I'm a little older. I'm Asian. And I value that stuff. And I come from a very diverse city. Like I'm from New York. I lived in Washington Heights. Washington Heights, we always call like little Dominican Republic. Like I like the fact that my son grew up in a neighborhood where people thought he was Latino. Like I think that stuff is really valuable. So it's always been like an implicit value of my family and me anyway. So, and we really did, I mean, I hate to say like the thing, but we hired the best people we got, and the best people we got were women. And that kind of puts, in some ways it puts to this, it's anecdotal, but it puts to, it's a direct sort of different experience. And like, well, we hire the best people we got and they're all men. Like, if that's true, then maybe you're not looking in the right places, right?
Yes. Oh, I hear that all the time. Well, we want the best candidate, always from a white guy too.
Yeah, right.
Oh, okay. You're just looking in your own network, which happens to be a bunch of other white guys. So
yes,
no wonder.
That's right. And look, I mean, my co-founder is a white male, but I also think, people hire. I mean, the thing we hear is we end up hiring people we're comfortable with, and the people we're comfortable with often look like us, right? And I think the people I'm comfortable with are people that I can collaborate well with. And I think that if you can get along with a group of different people, like you end up with a network of different people, right? And as an East Coast person, I never shy away from conflict. Like I used to be a lawyer, right? And I'm from New York City. So like the two most argumentative kinds of people like are in me. And I love people who will push back on ideas, right? I think that's a plus, not a minus.
Yeah.
So people who don't agree with me and who can be articulate and help me be better, like I love those people. I don't need someone to go along with me, right? I want to know if I'm doing the wrong thing. So I think I value that kind of exchange, and the people who are able to engage me and like lead me in different directions. I really value that.
That's really admirable. I like that. You're admitting that other people know more than you, which is not always what people tend to say.
I mean, as a role, I'm a producer, which means I know a little about a lot of things. Yeah. So it's very easy to find someone who knows more than me. In fact, like I really enjoy working with people who know more than me, because it's a chance to learn from, some of the best people in the business, right? So why not? I want to hire people who know more than me. I don't have a ton of ego in being right. I love being right, but I love and it doesn't mean, right now. Like if you show me how the right answer, I'm also love understanding that. And I think that that's the thing about games, is that you have to be really humble, right? As good as you are, there's the next thing can be really like slice of humble pie.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. I mean, you look at athletes, right? You could go out, you see Steph Curry light it up in one game, and the next game he's 4 for 20 or something like that. Like even the greatest players in the world have an off day. Like I think that that's really, I love using sports as a metaphor, because we're not robots, right? We can be up, we can be down. And I think that there's always an element of humility, like you have to approach in your work. So, and as a producer, it's easy to be humble because everyone, I'm the least knowledgeable about almost everything in any given moment, right? But I know a lot about a little bit about a lot of things.
Yeah. So you've been at a lot of big studios and shipped super successful games. What do you think the secret sauce to making a hit is? Why do some games succeed and others fail?
Oh man, I mean, we used to say this at Oculus and Meta Reality Labs. And it's easy to say, and I'm not going to just call out them for failing to do this sometimes, but we often say do fewer things better.
Yeah.
Is really focus. And I see a lot of examples of this. Like I think about EverQuest, and EverQuest was successful because the team, Brad McQuaid led that team. They chose a set of problems to solve, and they solved them they solve as few new problems as possible in the most efficient way. So one of the things that they did was I remember this is a huge lesson, right? Is they were one of the first games that required 3D hardware acceleration. And that solved a lot of software rendering problems because they could just rely on a 3D hardware card and could focus on art direction. Their game design was really like an extension of what Brad had run as a MUD admin. They built a server architecture that had hard server boundaries so that when you moved from one region to the other, the world would freeze and, it would reload the thing in. At the time, the competitive game was Asheron's Call, and they had a software renderer that was very powerful. They had this streaming world where it didn't have hard server boundaries. But as I recall talking to, I think it was Tim Brennan, who was the CTO of that studio, those decisions cost them nearly a year of development time, which means we were out before them and our game looked better because it was 3D hardware accelerated. Like the consumer doesn't care, right? The consumer just wants the game to look good, right? We were lucky at the time because 3D hardware acceleration was just taking off, but it was really the focus of the team to do fewer things better and in the most efficient way possible, and having like a clear vision of that. I think PopCap had that also, and I think it's really hard to give up the things you really care about in a game because everything seems so good. And I think that at teams that are very atomic, like Meta or Google, each team owns a little piece.
Yeah.
And if you give it up, like your whole incentive structure is gone. Like, what do you mean I'm not going to work on this feature anymore? Like my whole year was on that. How am I going to get reviewed on this, right? So there's a real kind of incentive resistance to doing fewer things better. So even though we'd say it, if you looked at what fewer things did we do, no one could come up with it because no one wanted to give up the thing, right? Versus other games are like cutting features and paring away things. And my teams at Inside Oculus were like that. We're like, we'd look at the production budget. I'm like, okay, we don't have time for all these things. Like, make some cuts. We're going to keep this one thing, but make some other cuts. And we cut it. And some people's features went away. They were super unhappy about it, but they, give them a couple of days. They got over it and we got on board, right? So those are the things I think is that kind of focus on what you want, and having and be able to make hard decisions around it, because it's easy to cheerlead when everything's going well, but when things go poorly, which it always does, like what decisions do you make then? I also think the other thing, I remember the story from PopCap in the original PVZ days where George Fan's team, who did the original PVZ, the story goes that they were done with the game. They hit their deliverable and they went to the CEO of PopCap, which is then a privately held company, and said, look, the game's done. I think I need another year to make this like really special. And the story goes, they gave it to him. Like, who would give, if you were at EA Mobile, and I went to you and you're like, hey, my game is done, but I need another year, you'd be like, well, sure, how come it's not out then? Right? So, that sort of creative vision gave that team, again, it's all anecdote, right? So take this with a grain of salt, but that team got the opportunity to make what I would consider one of the best games of all time in that year. And I think the lesson is like there's some lesson in there. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but that sort of like clarity of vision, the trust in your team. I think that's a thing that's really important. And clarity of vision is not like I said, it's not when things are going well. Like you need that clarity of vision most when things are going badly, because you want to know what you're holding on to in the middle of the storm. What are you holding on to?
Yeah.
Right. Because everything is getting washed away. What are you going to hold on to? Right. And that's the thing you want to defend. And I think good producers do this. Like, this is what I think a producer is really good at. A good producer should be able to defend the clarity of vision when shit hits the fan. And it's not about like running a stand-up or doing agile or shit like that. Like, that's all good data. Yeah. But knowing what the vision is and holding on to it when everything else is moving, like, what are you locking down? And I think that's the thing that from my point of view, is like helps make a great game.
A book sitting here. I'll send you a copy. It's called The One Thing. It's about how you need to simplify everything in your life and just think, what is the one thing I need to do this week to be successful? And then do that thing, cut out all the other stuff. So games in life, maybe too.
Yeah. And that's a pattern in a lot of things. In sports,
Yeah.
it's the same way, right? Like, don't think too far ahead. Like, what is the one thing that's important right now, and focus on it? Because the more you distract yourself, the less you're going to put into that one thing.
Yeah. And then you'll kind of half-ass a bunch of
Yep.
things.
Yep. Which has its own kind of like weird enabling comfort to it. Like, oh, if I do a little bit of everything, maybe that's better than no. Like, if you know what the one thing is,
Do it.
Yeah, commit.
Yeah. There are so many ups and downs, and I feel like near death experiences in games, right? Things that just go terribly, terribly wrong. Tell me about the maybe seemingly worse situation you've been in and how you had to pivot to make it work or not work and have a lesson from that.
It's a story. When I was interviewing, I would tell a lot of people, when people ask me about like how I defend a division. So one of these experiences we were making for Quest was an onboarding new user experience called First Steps. And what the things we did at Oculus were they were playable, gamey experiences, but they weren't games. They used game mechanics to introduce VR to people. Because VR is a real life like game system, right? It's not a web 2D mouse point and click UI. It is like picking up, throwing things, holding things, pointing, physics, like all these things, right? So we built this experience, and the centerpiece of this experience was a dancing experience where you get to dance with a robot. And I will say, when people like ask me, like, how do you know it's good, when a good thing is, I think about this moment when an animator and an engineer prototype dancing with this robot in VR. And we all, team got together and everyone showed off their prototypes. And we all knew when we played this thing, like, it was amazing. It was super janky. It was, just a temp character, but dancing with a robot. And again, like, you have to be in VR to feel like you're holding hands and dancing with a robot. Like, it's this magical experience. We all knew it was going to be good, right? And we that was the one thing that we held on to. So we built this, and we get greenlit to do this, right? And mostly, to the credit of Oculus leadership at the time, they kind of like got out of our way. We delivered all these things that were great before. Mark really loved this experience called Toy Box, which we made. He spent hours in it. So we got a lot of latitude from leadership. But we started building this thing, and Facebook has a very open culture where everyone can comment on everyone else's work. Like, it's a big, like, it's its own mini social network inside the company, right? So you'd post things and people had opinions on it. We talk about it. You'd like it. You'd leave comments, the whole thing. And a lot of people started playing our experience, and they hated dancing. They're like, it makes me anxious. It's socially awkward. I don't like it. Like, it's creepy. The robot stares in my eyes. All these things. And I would say, like, well, thank you for the feedback. By this time I learned just not to, like, come on, you're, what do you know? Like, you're,
yes,
you're
thank you
an OS engineer. Like, but like, it's legitimate feedback. Like, and we did a lot of user research testing, and we found out people like it. And I would pose people to this question, like, well, you think dancing makes you feel socially awkward. Well, we have guns in our game, and they feel like real guns. I mean, they're zap guns. They're kind of like arcadey guns. But why is one okay and the other is not? Like, if you ask me, what would I rather have go on in my house, guns or dancing? Yeah. I'm pretty sure I'd say dancing like 10 times out of 10. But that doesn't matter, right? Like, the other thing you learn is that oftentimes a rational approach doesn't help turn people's minds, because they all think they're being rational themselves, right? So as is Facebook's way, this grew in controversy, right? Like, a few people jumped onto this idea in this public forum, and it convinced everyone, like, dancing is terrible, take it out. And I reminded people, like, do you think there's a gender component to this? Because if you go to a wedding, right, this is all anecdotal, but if you go to a wedding, usually women are the first people on the dance floor, and they've got to drag their men on the dance floor, right? Like, barely, there are unique people, men who like get up and dance, and I envy those people. I think I am one of those people that have to be dragged out to dance. And my wife is a modern dancer, so she's always like the first one out there. And I think there is a little bit of a gender bias, right? Of like dancing is a more feminine behavior. And guess what? My company, old company, used to be mostly men.
Yep.
And they were like not, and of a company mostly men, they were mostly software engineers
Who don't dance.
who don't dance, right? So
Yeah.
I'm like, well, I get you don't like it.
Yeah.
Because you're an awkward nerd. And like, I am also an awkward nerd, but I would love to be that guy who got up and danced. I would have met more girls this way when I was younger, like all that stuff, right? I would have been a better person. And I even now I feel guilty, like when my wife wants to dance and I can't like get up the nerve to join her. I'm like, I feel bad about myself, right? So I suggested this too, and of course, like people are like, well, no, you're accusing me of like so they were going to cut it, and we escalated to Andrew Bosworth, who was running the organization at the time, and he said, well, what's the user research say? And we showed him the user research, and he says, well, what's the team belief? I'm like, team wants to do it, and he was like, okay, well, what's the problem, right? Like he was very matter of fact because he didn't really care, right? He's so there was a guy, a software engineer, who posted in an internal group, said, why would we let this robot do something in this game that if I did in the office would be a fireable offense? Like, because he thought it would be like a HR violation if I asked you to dance, right? If we work together.
Okay.
I went from that to like, okay, just do it. And it turned out to be the highest rated experience on the Oculus Quest, on the Oculus Store for like 3 years, the highest rating by users. So it was the right thing to do. And I had a senior engineer, tell me the story of like, I danced, I didn't like it. I thought it might be awkward. I brought it home. I showed my wife. She loved it. I'm like, oh, surely she's just saying this. And I showed the rest of my family and they all loved it. And he said to me, literally, and he was a software engineer, is like, maybe we shouldn't have these decisions run by male software engineers sitting in Menlo Park. And I was like, you think?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and any marketing person would tell you, you're not the target market. Software engineer making $600,000 a year at Facebook are not the target audience for this device, right? But marketing also has relatively little pull, consumer marketing inside a company like Facebook, because it's relatively new to them. So I think that was like one of the biggest struggles that I had, because I tried to be the shit umbrella for the team, but the negative feedback was so overwhelming.
Wow.
That people were like, well, are we going to cut this? Like, how can we cut it? And it's not like a web service or website where you can cut pages and redirect things. Like the whole experience is built on top of each other. It's not like, you could just excise this roll, have one change list roll back and suddenly it all works. That was really tough, right? And that kind of showed me the challenge of making something with a strong creative point of view inside a company that doesn't necessarily have the vocabulary to talk about it. Everything you do can be taken away by people who don't share the same frames of reference you do. So that kind of like, that taught me a lot of conviction. And I think I won a lot of credibility with my team because I really was the person who pushed back on a lot of this. And, in some ways the detriment of my career, right? I was very vocally like, no, thank you for your feedback, but we're not changing this, right? And software engineers run the place, and I'm not a software engineer. So for me to go say no to a bunch of software engineers, of course, in theory, it's okay. But in practice, it's not easy to do, right?
That's interesting because I think a lot of ideas must get squashed by a certain group of people who are not the target audience for what they're building.
We had an OS, one of the engineers on the OS team, on the VR OS team, tell one of the marketing people, this is a story she told me. He told her, I am the target audience because I paid money for my own Quest. And she was like, you literally don't know what a target market is.
Yeah.
Like literally, you don't understand it. But how do you tell a senior engineer inside Facebook that you fundamentally don't understand a thing? and you're this woman who works in marketing, right?
Yeah.
Like the power imbalance is gigantic. So she had to sit and smile and like understand, but we have market research that shows this other thing. But what she really wanted to say is like, you literally don't know what a target market is.
I don't think I could work at Facebook because I would definitely say that.
And look,
I have my own business.
yeah, no, I think it's funny because that's the, those are the implicit rules of any workplace that you never hear about, right? That who has the power. And Facebook was founded by engineers. So of course, engineers, like they were there first. They built the thing. They have the glow of being the original founders of the company from Mark all the way down. So, and I think the culture is used to everyone jumping into everyone else's business, which I think works for a lot of things. But when it becomes so different, where an OS engineer is jumping into marketing's business, like that no longer works. That's like multiple hops, right? So you're not in the same area code anymore. You're a different time zone. So the farther away you are, the harder it is for those two people to be relevant to each other. So I get why there's a cultural problem. And if they could just hash it out like domain experts, they could do that. But it was really it was an eye-opening kind of experience. And I think, the structures that work for a company in some context hold them back in others, which is sort of the pleasure of starting my own small company. I really admire Supergiant, the team that made Bastion and Transistor and Hades, right? That they work hard to maintain their team size because they feel, I think, like the culture they have is really like not necessarily scalable to much bigger. Like if they want to go make a AAA game and have someone write them a $100 million check, they could probably do it. But they're like, I don't know, 20 people or whatever it is, and that those are the kind of games they want to make, and they want to make that team size. I think that's really admirable. They don't think that they could meaningfully keep the things they value to a different team scale, and they don't even want to try, I think.
Yeah. That's really knowing your why, which is so hard, I think, to come up with, and having your vision and staying true when you could expand and go all these different directions, right? It's so tempting.
Right. And I could say like, oh, that's going to be our model too. But, who knows, right? If someone says like, hey, go make the next super duper quadruple A game and here's $250 million. Like, what am I going to say? I mean, not that that's going to happen, but like, what am I going to say? Am I going to really say no? Like, it's really, you can't judge till you're there. But I think that's as a producer, I tell people I'm a good producer, but I wouldn't know how to run 1,000-person game like a Destiny 2. I have no idea how they do that.
That's where the smarter people come in, or the people who are smart in that area.
Right. They want to do this.
Yeah,
right?
That's what they love. And that's not your genius zone. So
when I left Destiny, Bungie, and I went to PopCap, I remember landing on the team and I knew the team's names in a week. I played the build and I understood the game all in a week. My first week. I'm like, okay, I know the engineering team. I know the design team. I know our team. I play the game. I kind of get it. Took me like a week and a half to do it, right? And I love that. Like that's so good, right? Like I really like knowing the team. I like talking to people. Like I am a personal connections producer, not necessarily a process producer. So, but you need a process producer to run 1,000-person team.
Yeah.
And that seems less interesting to me.
Well, it's good you know what you are and what you aren't, and you're not trying to. Yeah. And I admire people who can do the other thing, like, and I'm sure I could learn it if I had to. Yeah.
But I really like, this is why I like working on my old team at Oculus. Was, we're at biggest we were 50 people, including contractors and outsourcing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but the unusual thing about this team is we were small, between 20 and 50, but each one of our people were like AAA kind of talent, right? Like they were all really ambitious, really good, really, really driven. And we had, I think our animator was, worked on these Hollywood movies and these games. He was he animated the character Rango for the DreamWorks movie. Our character artist did the Hulk for the Avengers movie. Like these like crazy talented people, but there's like 30 of us. So it was really like a dream. like in a lot of ways like a dream team where I got to be exposed to people in a very intimate work next to each other way that I would never have gotten at a AAA studio, but they were AAA talents, right?
Yeah, that is the
So
best. With
I had,
funding and you can do what you want and you're working with awesome people.
and that's why I'm super grateful for my time at Oculus. Like I have, no ill will at all. Like it was a great ride, and I got to learn a ton on Mark's dime. Like Mark paid me money, and I learned a ton. Like how good is that? Like that's pretty good.
That's the best.
Yeah.
So how big was it when you joined? Tell me about the journey through.
Yeah, so Oculus was about 300 people when I joined, and then now the Reality Labs group is in the tens of thousands. I think in a lot of ways, Facebook is good at things like scaling, which I don't think Oculus was good at. But Oculus had a much clearer vision of what VR could be. And I think it was much more, I mean, I wouldn't say pure, but a little more informed by what they were building, not by the fantasy of what they thought it could be. Like you often hear Facebook and Mark talk about, I want 1 billion users in VR. And that's a great long-term goal, but you kind of, again, it's like you get out of bed and you try to decide to be more fit and exercise more, and then you look at like Everest and say like, yeah, I'm going to do that. Like, well, maybe you should eat well and exercise every day before you do the next thing. And then, in a couple of years, maybe we could talk about, Mount Rainier. And then after that, maybe we could talk about Everest, but don't even think about that stuff now, right? Like just focus on walking 5 times a day, or, 5 days a week and eating well or something like that. So I think that the original Oculus leadership was very pragmatic about like, well, here are the things we want to do, and we want to make VR great. The thing I loved was I reported to one of the founders of the organization, Nate.
Oh, I didn't know
Nate
that.
Mitchell. Yeah, so I reported to him, and then like, as Facebook sort of became more Facebook, I got farther and farther away from the leadership, right? And that was frustrating. Like I shipped all this, I worked in the AR group at the end, and I was buried under, multiple layers and disciplines from the people that ran the organization. And I looked around and I thought, I'm the only person here that shipped anything really great in VR. And I don't know, there's a not safe for word way of like, who do I have to bribe to get someone to buy me a drink around here, right? Like, it's hard, right? Because you get buried in this in the structure, and that's the thing that's what I used to be able to go talk to Brendan and Nate all the time. And even when Hugo Barrett came in, I got to talk to Hugo, right? Because my team built BOGO, and BOGO was this virtual pet experience that Hugo used to sort of show off the pre-release Quest to everyone. Like he loved it, right? It was such a good demo for him. So anytime I needed him, like Hugo would make himself available to me. But as we became more Facebooky,
Yeah.
so many layers of people inserted themselves in between people like me and leadership that I felt like anything I had to say that was pointed or critical or, contrarian or concerning.
You?
You couldn't say it, right? Like, yeah, I know. Like, I know. I always tell people I always look on the negative side because producers are paid to worry about the bad shit, right? So I'm always worried about that stuff, right? Like that's I have to teach myself to be a little more celebratory of the positive, because anytime something good happens, I'm like, great, what's the next bad thing that can happen, right? And let me avoid that. And that's sort of that's kind of my strength and my flaw as a leader, is that I dwell on the negative. And I need to give more airtime to the positive. In fact, a junior producer who is now a senior producer at Bungie worked for me, and she's the one who reminded me, like, hey, we got to celebrate the wins too. And I'm like, we do? All right, of course we do. So, it's not good to be like Tiger Dad all the time. But at a certain level, it is your job to call out the icebergs, right? Someone's got to stand on the mast on the bridge of the Titanic and look out for the iceberg, and someone's going to do it. And not everyone, for a lot of reasons, is incentivized. Well, it's not that big an iceberg, or I think we're going to miss it. Like, no, this is a real thing. We have to think about it, right? And I think that that's another thing that you really want to celebrate, or celebrate people that bring up concerns rather than like disincentivize them.
Yeah, it is helpful if someone pipes up in a meeting that or later tells you the meeting didn't go well, or something you missed something really important.
Yeah.
But that is the best to know. And a lot of people also won't tell you. They'll just let it slide. So
Yeah, it's an interesting. There was a thing that happened inside Meta. Something had gone wrong, and it got up to very senior leadership, and the senior leadership was like, "Why didn't anybody tell me any of this sooner?" And the interesting thing is, people knew. I think the real question should have been, what incentive systems and what cultures have we inadvertently built that prevented me from finding this out sooner? Right? It's not like, why didn't someone tell me sooner? Like, if this person did, skipped 5 levels or 6 levels below them and just had lunch with 8 people or 5 people, they would have found out about this, right? This was on everyone's minds. And this is not just true at this company. It's like every big company. It's like,
yeah, for sure.
Why didn't we find out about this sooner? And then the question I have is, if you're a good leader, the question you should ask yourself is, what incentives have I created that hid this from me? Right? Like, someone would have said this.
Yeah, I mean, it's like walking on the factory floor and finding out what's really going on.
Undercover boss.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Like, that's exactly the thing, right? Like, this is not just because you're Facebook doesn't mean you're Meta. You're not immune to this, or Google or General Motors or IBM. Like, there's always this disconnect, right? So how do you build an incentive structure that lets the existential problems bubble up to you in a way that isn't career threatening, right, for the people that have the concerns?
Yeah.
And I think that's a question that I mean, a lot of the Facebook leadership is much younger than I am. Maybe they didn't, maybe they hadn't thought about this yet, right? Just because they're billionaires doesn't mean they know everything. So those are the things I think about, like, when trying to start my own thing, is like, I just had a one-on-one with our animator, and I said, look, I know that I'm more senior and older than you, but I want you to treat me as a peer. Like, you understand things I do not understand.
Yeah.
And I need you, like, to tell me when I'm wrong, to lead me when I don't to lead me to a conclusion. Tell me why, show me your math, like all that stuff. I need to know, right? I want to create a culture of like more peer accountability. And just because I'm the quote CEO or the founder or whatever, it doesn't make me right. And I try to stay out of other people's businesses, much like I have design opinions, but I want my designer to own that shit. So, but you only learn that stuff from failure and experience. So maybe it's, unfair for me to expect, these meteoric billionaires to sometimes understand failure, because maybe they've never known failure, And
they grew so fast. The growth is crazy. And I think it's really hard to adapt. Not that it's okay, but I think when you're going from 300 to 10,000 people in a span of how many years?
Yeah, it's 9 years.
New processes and systems and new culture and just new everything too.
It's funny. I think I think of indie teams, and often people think of these like outlier teams, like their first game is super successful. But I think a lot of really good indie teams have the weight of AAA or big commercial game experience and failures behind them. Like, they learned a lot of, one of the founders at Supergiant worked on Command and Conquer out of EALA, and that was a really like a death march and didn't do well. And I'm guessing that if you asked him, what did he learn from it? It was a shit ton.
Totally.
Right. And that informed probably how he thinks about his work at a studio, his indie studio. Right. But you don't necessarily think about that, because you think of them as a studio as like an indie hit studio. Right. But you forget about all the bad lessons, all the scars you've learned from the other stuff. So I think failure is a really good teacher. I know it's a cliche, but I see it all the time, right? Like, the time to fail isn't when you're a multi-billion-dollar company or trillion-dollar company. The time to fail, hopefully, is you learn earlier, and then you can apply those lessons, right? So
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective because sometimes hiring managers tell me they don't like the certain studio because the game didn't do well, but maybe people learn so much because
Oh
they
yeah.
do well. And
Well,
so,
when I interview people, when I interview, when I'm being interviewed, I'll often ask the interviewer, I've got a couple answers to that. Do you want to hear success, like a successful exercise this scenario, or a failure scenario, right? Because I can talk about either. Um, and I think in a good interview, you talk about at least one success and one failure,
right.
right? Because if every example is like this was super successful, then you're like, well, what'd you learn from it? Like it's really hard to, you have survivorship bias, right? Like what did you learn from that? Were you lucky or are you good? Um, Failures we tend to dwell over and think about more. So I feel like a good interviewer will allow a candidate the confidence, the safeness of talking about a failure. Like don't make me think you're, God's gift, best thing since sliced bread. Like talk me through a failure case. And I think that that's really good.
And not that you volunteer too much or you care too much. It's your failure.
Yeah. Those are the terrible the terrible answers, and everyone knows, right? Like those are
Yeah, for sure. But some people have a harder time being real with you and vulnerable. So helpful.
yeah. And I think for people who are, listeners here who are interviewing, um, I got really good at it because I interviewed people a lot inside the company. Like, I don't know, I probably interviewed 100 people, 150 people inside this company, inside Meta, Facebook, Oculus in my time there. So like practice is really important, right? Getting someone who's maybe more senior to like run through a practice interview with you and who's not afraid to give you real feedback. Like, hey, that felt really disingenuous or something like that. I think that that's the best way, like practice, right? How do you get to Carnegie Hall?
Yes. And people always say they don't know what went wrong. And it is frustrating. I mean, sometimes you take a test at a big company and the company is going to keep their test for the next 5 years. So they're not going to give you feedback on the test. So you failed, but you don't know how. So I think being able to bounce ideas off somebody else is key and get that real feedback.
Yeah. And there's lots of communities to do that. Like a lot of the Facebook Meta layoff people were giving each other interviews. Just to help everyone's interviewing skills get up. Because whatever you lay off 11,000 people, you have a broad variety of people that have, seniority and experience and discipline. So people were setting up informal interview groups where they would give each other feedback, and it was fantastic. Like it just made people better interviewers.
Yeah.
So that's really useful for people. Like practice is never. Every time I've not done well in an interview, it's because I didn't prepare for it enough, I think.
Absolutely. People don't take it seriously. I think they're taking it more seriously now, though. But what's really frustrating to me is when people say, oh, I applied for 1,000 jobs and like, okay, you're doing it wrong. How could you even apply for 1,000 jobs? Who do you know? How can you stand out? How can you be a little bit more logical about your search instead of just blasting into the abyss and then getting disappointed?
Yeah, I saw someone on Twitter say like talk about like you applied for 1,000 jobs. I don't think there's 1,000 jobs I'm qualified to work in the entire world for. Like what?
No.
What do you mean 1,000 jobs? I hear you, but it's also scary, right? It's like that, it's a time of kind of economic and social unrest, and people get desperate, right? And scared, and they react like they do a lot of shallow breathing. And it's hard to slow things down, right? That's one thing I learned from competing as an athlete, as a very mediocre athlete, is when things get stressful, you have to slow things down. And that is true for sports, and that's true for your job situation. Like slow things down, right? Like don't, there's no use in staying up to 1 a.m. to sending out more implications.
Or getting laid off and kind of adding a couple sentences to your old resume and then just blasting it off that day.
Oh my God.
So upset.
Yeah. I tore apart my whole resume after I got laid off, and I rewrote it from the ground up. And it actually took me a colleague to tell me that. Like, you think I should know, right? And she said, she was another producer, and she was like, throw it all away, start from scratch. And it was so liberating to do that. Like, oh, this is great. So that was really helpful. But you think with all my experience, I'd know that shit, and it took a friend to tell me.
Yeah, I remember job seeking and it was super confusing. And it's really helpful to have someone else tell you, hey, maybe you should do this, or, you don't need to have your experiences working at Molly Moons on your resume, stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure.
And helpful. You mentioned that you think the Apple headset's going to be huge. Tell me more about the future of virtual reality, mixed reality, and where you think things are headed.
So one of the things we knew early on, even the early pre-Rift days, like Crescent Bay, is when you put on the headset, it's all black, right?
Yeah.
And we heard this early on, even where there's probably a gender difference where woman sitting around her room is probably more uncomfortable with being vulnerable than a man, right? Like, there's something fundamentally different about the way women see social safety than men. But even for men, like being in a headset and seeing black all around you is disconcerting. Like, you don't see a floor. Your entire brain has evolved from whatever, like we crawled out of the ocean. We're like, okay, we have a ground here. Like, this is part of our life. So what I think the Apple headset and I think Quest 3 do is the pass-through mixed reality, augmented reality stuff. Like, you see your room, like you put the headset on and you still see the room. This continuity of user experience is going to make people like at a lizard brain level more comfortable using the hardware than even the Quest 2, which is a great device. So I think that's going to change how people think about this thing. It becomes not this like weird, Marquis de Sade kind of device you put on to like freak yourself out. Like, it's going to be the smoother extension of your life, right? Like, you put on the headset, you still see your room, UI comes up in front of you. You can choose to go into VR, you can stay in mixed reality. Like, I think that's just going to be a better user experience for lots of people. And I think the Apple headset, it's interesting because it seems like they're going for, and I don't have any, I'm not on the developer list or anything like that yet. They're going for a device that has more accessibility for people. Like, it's a little more mainstream, and that's the kind of game we're trying to make, is a little more of a mainstream game, not an extraction shooter in VR, right? Like, and I think that approach, as well as Apple's sort of, reputation for great hardware, is really powerful. I also think they're doing something that's very smart in that the Apple Vision Pro is essentially a developer's kit. It's expensive, right? So when you build a PlayStation 5 game, you buy a PS5 dev kit. PS5 dev kit is like tens of thousands of dollars, right? It's like expensive. It's a high-end PC. And you buy it because you believe in the future of the PlayStation 5, right? Like, I need this 20,000, I don't know how much it is, but it's $20,000 PC to build PlayStation 5 games. So when the PS5 comes out for $400, my games are going to run on it. So I think they did something really clever, which is they built a fairly polished dev kit for people to play with. And when the next headset comes out, which I assume there is, that's the rumor, it's going to be a lot cheaper. And everyone who's been messing around on the Apple Vision Pro will like, okay, now the audience is here, the price point's here, I'm ready to go. And we did that with Crescent Bay on Rift. But I think, maybe Santa Cruz had a little bit of that, but I think they're really like seeding the market with really robust DK1 and DK2 in the early Oculus days before my time, like, was the same thing. I think that's a really important thing. And I think Apple's doing this in a way that is really great. And I think it's going to, and there are more people now excited about it than Meta was, even though the Quest Pro is a really great piece of hardware. There's something about Apple coming to the market, like, gives it a little bit of like sizzle, like, ooh,
it's Apple.
Yeah, it's Apple.
Yeah.
And I think they can sell people a $1,500 device that maybe Meta had a harder time with, right? Because you already spent $1,200 on an Apple iPhone 14 Max Pro.
Yeah.
Like, and if the next device is sort of the same price, like, look, you could buy the Apple phone, you can buy this. It's like they're both like, oh yeah, I bought that, I'll buy this, right? So it's like a different value proposition to the consumer, and the consumers are are, consumers aren't rational buyers all the time. Like we all get like caught up in the hype and this price psychology. So I think that like the device is a little more lifestyle, a little more mainstream appeal, a little sexier in hardware. I think they're seeding the market with really cool things that will appear on this device that aren't meant to be consumer sales driven. And by the time the next device comes out, it could be really significant. So I'm pretty excited about it.
I like that you're thinking of V2 already. But just like any new piece of hardware that comes out, it's always so expensive. The first one and the early adopters will get it and they'll play with it. And
$3,500. I know it's not a consumer device. Like I get it, and I think that's okay. It's not meant to be, right? It's meant to for me and for influencers and development studios. They're going to buy it. They're going to play with it. They're going to build things with it. They're going to ship demos with it. Like I think they're going to experiment with it, and I think that's a really smart thing.
Yeah.
And give people a lead time. So that's why I'm really excited about their approach. Is it's a little bit different than Meta. Like they're seeding the market with a piece of hardware that is not consumer ready, but widely available for experimentation. And I think that's the right thing. I think that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what the future holds for VR mixed reality. There are a few different options too. And I think when I first started recruiting for VR people, I don't think they felt the way they feel about NFTs right now, but maybe similar. People were really skeptical, displeased. I mean, with any new tech, but I think with all of the Meta acquisitions, people see value in it. Some people, I mean, not for everyone, of course.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I'd be curious about how many of those people really got to see some really moving, influential experiences. Because when I got the Valve demo, the room demo at the Valve office in here in Bellevue, I just never seen anything like it, right? Like I felt like I was in the room with these things. Like my body had these sensations. Like I put my face into a beam of light projecting from the floor in this VR room. And my friend was giving me the demo, and Doug said to me, like, does your face feel warmer? I'm like, it does. And he said, yeah, but it's not. But you're not really putting your face into a beam of light. And I was like, holy shit. Like my body is telling me things that aren't happening.
Yeah.
How could we not make great games from this? Like this has got to be a place we're going to make something amazing. So I think that those are the things that are still true. And I think that I get why people are skeptical. But I don't think they have to do with the format itself. I think it just has to do with like maybe the execution or the kinds of games that are like, I can't play games with movement because I get motion sick.
Oh, I had to take it off and sit down. I was playing some space game where I pressed a button and I transported. Made me feel so nauseous.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's really like, and why should someone, so an interesting thing about nausea, right? I read that it is an evolutionary response. Often when you eat something that's bad for you, to throw up, like poison, right?
Right.
So your body is telling you you're having a response as if you ingested poison. Why the hell am I going to put on the headset again?
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like for what? So I get there are people who are like, want to say like, hey, these games like, first person shooters in VR, you can't make a first person shooter in VR without smooth motion. So, they talk about getting your VR legs in or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's certainly valid. And those people are making games. Their games are making a ton of money that do this. But fundamentally, I don't want to do that. I don't want to recreate like a toxic nausea response in a body while they're playing my game, because they're not going to want to come back and play my game. Like you don't have to be, Will Wright to draw that design hypothesis of like, if I make you feel violently ill, like you ate poison or bad food and you're going to throw it up, that you're going to come back to my game. Like I don't need that association, right? And especially for a mainstream audience, like, I don't want them to have that reaction. Like I don't want them to get good, get their VR legs just to play my game. Like I that's not the kind of game that I want to make. And it's not to knock on other people who do, like they are more successful than maybe I could hope to be. But it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. I look forward to playing your not nauseating game. I have one more question for you. Let's say, imagine you have just won Game of the Year. Who would you think? Who in your career has made the biggest impact?
Oh, that's easy.
Okay.
The one person I'd thank is a guy named Doug Church. He was a project lead of some of the old school Looking Glass games, Ultima Underworld and System Shock and Thief. He is a brilliant programmer, kind of, when he was working on those games, doing the first, 2.5D, 3D renderers, he was, in the same kind of breath as Carmack. As a designer, I think he's as visionary as Will Wright. Like, he's a kind of a reclusive person, but I was a game reviewer, and I just had this like amazing curiosity, like intense curiosity about how he made these games that were really different. And we became friends. And he's given me really good advice throughout my career. I mean, just being in his orbit and Looking Glass's orbit has introduced me to people that I would never meet otherwise. He's, generous with his time and his advice to me and other people. And he's a good friend, right? I mean, I invited him to my wedding. So, like, not only was he like a professional guiding light advisor, kind of inadvertent advocate for me. When I moved to Seattle to work at Bungie, before we owned an apartment in New York City, and my son was in school, and went on Pullum. Like, I lived with him for a year. Like, he's like moving with me. He's just been a good friend and a brilliant person to just listen and talk to. And he also made me realize, like, as good as he is at design, people like that need producers, right? They need people to help orient them. They need people to like push on them. So, as I said, like, Doug is brilliant, but that doesn't mean he can do everything. And he kind of taught me that lesson also, right? So, he's a person I would thank. Although, if we had the funding and he was available, I just come work with us, man. Like, I'd love to make a game with him. And he's in Sweden working at Embark, doing some crazy procedural gameplay stuff. But anyway, that's who I think.
How did you connect with him again?
So I was a game reviewer.
Yeah.
And I played Ultima Underworld, and Ultima Underworld was this first like physics 2.5D game with like emergent gameplay, and nothing like that had existed before ever in PC games that as I knew. And I reviewed the game, and I wrote the most glowing review for it. And I just called up the studio, and I was like, hey man, I took the credits, and I said, like, who's Doug Church and how can I talk to him? And back then, like, he was kind of a nobody, right? It's just a new studio. And we just got on the phone and we started talking, right? Like, tell me about your game. So I was a journalist and a lawyer, and part of being a good journalist and lawyer is being curious about your subject matter, right? You have to ask questions and learn how to learn things. And I was just so curious about how this little team of MIT nerds like decided to got together and made a thing that really was I had never seen before. And we just became friends. Like, we stayed in touch because his, a game would come out, and I'd touch base with him and we talk, and they invited me to the launch parties, and I'd go hang out with them and meet the team. Seamus Blackley, Xbox guy, came out of that group. Irrational, Ken Levine came out of that group. Everyone may not know, but Half-Life was directly inspired by Doug's work. Like, his work has been so influential on so many people. But mostly we became friends because I could pick up the phone and talk to him. And I was not interested in brown nosing him. I was just really curious about how he built this thing and how they do this, right? And he became like one of the central figure. Like, when I got my job at Bungie, apparently the head of production called Doug and said, like, tell me about this guy. And
always
like,
go.
you should hire him. Like, so they did, right? Like, So like, again, it was that's how I got to know him. And I still talk to him a bunch. We ride our bikes together virtually on something called Zwift, which is like a video game platform. And we have a Discord, video chat running. It's 5 p.m. in Stockholm. It's 9 a.m. here in Seattle. And we try to do it. Right now, the weather's nice, so he's out riding during the day. But like, we try to still do that, like, once a week. And we talk about games. We talk about bikes. We talk about food. So I still do that, right? And so I that's who I thank. Like, there's hands down, there's no one been more helpful to my career, Des Doug, and hands down as a friend, he's been so helpful to me just as a friend, as a human being, and like giving me a bedroom in his place, and when we're on a budget, because I was paying rent in mortgage in New York and paying him rent here in Seattle. And when he heard about that, he refused to cash in my rent checks. Like, that's the kind of person, like that's a friend, right? So he's just like a wonderful human being, very reclusive. Like, he's shied away from fame. If he had any bone of self-promotion in his body, he'd be running games now. But that's not. He's the person, he wants to do the work. He's not interested in talking to the press, although he talked to me for I don't know why. But that's who I would thank.
And
thanks, Doug.
Oh, thanks, Doug. But thank you. You called him. You made it happen. It's like a butterfly effect, but you took the first action. So
that's the thing, right? Like, you got to do it.
How life works. Yeah, that's how you make stuff happen, for sure. Just
right.
reach it.
Fucking do it.
Yeah.
Just like pick up the phone. I tell my son, like, ask her out.
No.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. What do you have to lose?
Yeah. Like, you want that internship, here's a person, make the call. Right. And the worst thing you could do is hear a no, and then move on to the next thing.
Else. Yeah, totally.
So, but look, I have to follow that advice myself. Like, it's much easier said than done. I get it, for everyone who's interviewing. I totally get it. It helps when you're just deeply curious about a thing. Like, I just want to know more, right? Like, and I think it makes it a lot easier rather than feeling like I'm networking. It's just like, I want to understand this thing. Go to the person who did it.
Yeah, people, if you're genuine, people will talk to you. People you wouldn't think would talk to you, because they're so used to getting pinged all the time with sales and just BS. But if you really want to know about how something happened, I was so amazed when I started my business. People just talk and help, and people you'd never think.
I found that true even in trying to raise money. Like, there are things that I had no idea how many people that were able to help before I asked and just thought about it for a second, and like went through my network and said, like, who can help me? And I'm like, holy shit, a lot of people can help me.
Totally, but you have to ask and make it happen.
Yeah, it was intense.
Yeah. Well, congrats on everything. So exciting. We've been talking to Bernie Yee, who's the founder of a new company called Windup Minds. Bernie, where can people go to learn more about you or get in touch?
I'm on LinkedIn. I've been using that a lot more since I was laid off. So it's pretty cool. And you go www.windupminds.com and see what we're working on. We'll probably, by the time this hits the air, we should have announced and, thanked our investors, our angel investors, our venture funds, my team lineup. You'll see we're interviewing one more designer, and could be another woman. So we could be like, 5-3 or something like that, 6-3, 6-2. But you'll see our lineup and our team and what we've worked on before. It's a really great group of, veterans and more junior people. And hopefully maybe we'll even see a little bit more about what we're working on, broadly speaking. So we'll see.
Looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, Lizzie. This is great.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for listening to the show this week. To catch all the latest from Here's Waldo, you can follow us on LinkedIn. Be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. We'll see you next time.